Well, Casey, let's talk about war.
Let's talk about war. And what is it good for? Some say absolutely nothing. Others write books arguing the opposite.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been wanting to talk about AI and technology and the military for a while on the show now, because I think what's really flying under the radar of kind of the mainstream tech press these days is that there's just been a huge shift in Silicon Valley toward making things for the military and the U.S. military in particular. Years ago, it was the case that most of the big tech companies, they were sort of very reluctant to work with the military, to sell things to the Department of Defense, to make products that could be used in war. They had a lot of ethical and moral quandaries about that, and their employees did too. But we've really seen a shift over the past few years. There are now a bunch of sort of startups working in defense tech, making things that are designed to be sold to the military and to national security forces. And we've also just seen a big effort at the Pentagon to modernize their infrastructure, to update their technology, to not get beat by other nations when it comes to having the latest and greatest weapons.
Yeah. And also, Kevin, just the rise of AI in general, I think, has a lot of people curious about what the military thinks of what is going on out here. And is it eventually going to have to adopt a much more aggressive AI strategy than the one it has today?
Yeah. So a few weeks ago, I met a guy named Chris Kirchhoff. He's one of the authors, along with Raj Shah, of a book called Unit X. Chris is sort of a longtime defense tech guy. He's been working in this area for a long time. He was involved in a number of tech projects for the military. He worked at the National Security Council during the Obama administration. Fun fact, he was the highest ranking openly gay advisor in the Department of Defense for years. And most importantly, he was a founding partner of something called the Defense Innovation Unit, or DIU. It also goes by the name Unit X, which is basically this little experimental division that was set up about a decade ago by the Department of Defense to try to basically bring the Pentagon's technology up to date. And he and Raj Shah, who was another founding partner of the DIU, just wrote a book called Unit X that basically tells the story of how the Pentagon sort of realized that it had a problem with technology and set out to fix it. So I just thought we should bring in Chris to talk about some of the changes that he has seen in the military when it comes to technology and in Silicon Valley when it comes to the military.
Let's do it.
Chris Kirchhoff, welcome to Hard Fork. So I think people hear a lot about the military and technology, and they kind of assume that there are like very futuristic things happening inside the Pentagon that we'll hear about at some point in the future. But a lot of what's in your book is actually about old technology and how underwhelming some of the military's technological prowess is. Your book opens with an anecdote about your co-author actually using a compact digital assistant because it was better. It had better navigation tools than the navigation system on his $30 million jet. That was sort of how you introduced the fact that the military is not quite as technologically sophisticated as many people might think. So I'm curious, when you first started your work with the military, what was the state of the technology?
Well, it's really interesting. So, I mean, you go to the movies, and we have all seen Mission Impossible and James Bond, and wouldn't it be wonderful if that actually were the reality behind the curtain? But when you open up the curtain, you realize that actually in this country, there are two entirely different systems of technological production. There's one for the military, and then there's one for everything else. And to dramatize this, on the image of our book, Unit X, we have an iPhone, and on top of the iPhone is sitting an F-35, the world's most advanced fighter jet, a fifth-generation stealth fighter, known as a flying computer for its incredible sensor fusion and weapon suites. But the thing about the F-35 is that its design was actually finalized in 2001, and it did not enter operations until 2016. And a lot happened between 2001 and 2016, including the invention of the iPhone, which, by the way, has a faster processor in it than the F-35. And if you think about the F-35 over the subsequent years, there's been 3 technological upgrades to it. And we're now, we're almost an iPhone 16 season. And once you understand that, you understand why it was really important that the Pentagon thought about establishing a Silicon Valley office to start accessing this whole other technology ecosystem that is faster and generally a lot less expensive than the firms that produce technology for the military.
Yeah, I remember years ago, I interviewed your former boss, Ash Carter, the former Secretary of Defense, who died in 2022. And I sort of expected that he'd want to talk about like all the newfangled stuff that the Pentagon was making, autonomous drones, stealth bombers. But instead, we ended up talking about procurement, which is basically how the government buys stuff, whether it's a fighter jet or an iPhone. And I remember him telling me that procurement was just unbelievably complicated, and it was a huge part of what made government and the military in particular so inefficient and kind of backwards technologically. Describe how the military procures things, and then what you discovered about how to maybe short circuit that process or make it more efficient.
If you're looking to buy a nuclear aircraft carrier or a nuclear submarine, you can't really go on Amazon and price shop for that.
And I learned that the hard way, by the
way. Should have upped your credit limit,
Yeah.
Casey. And so, in those circumstances, when the government is representing the taxpayer and buying one large military system, a multi-billion-dollar system from one vendor, it's really important that the taxpayer not be overcharged. And so the Pentagon has developed a really elaborate system of procurement to ensure that it can control how production happens, the cost of individual items. And that works okay if you're in a situation where you have the government and one firm that makes one thing. It doesn't make any sense, though, if you're buying goods that multiple firms make or that are just available on the consumer market. And so one of the challenges we had out here in Silicon Valley when we first did a defense innovation unit was trying to figure out how to work with startups and tech companies who, it turns out, weren't interested in working with the government. And the reason why is that the government typically buys defense technology through something called the Federal Acquisition Rules, which is a little bit like the Old Testament. It's this dictionary-size book of regulations. Letting a contract takes 18 to 24 months. If you're a startup, your investors tell you not to go down that path for a couple reasons. One, you're not going to make enough money before your next valuation. You're going to have to wait too long. You're going to go out of business before the government actually closes the sale. And two, even if you get that first contract, it's totally possible another firm with better lobbyists is going to take it right back away from you. So at Defense Innovation Unit, we had to figure out how to solve that paradox.
Part of what I found interesting about your book was just the sort of accounts that you gave of these sort of clever loopholes that you and your team found around some of the bureaucratic sort of slowness at the Pentagon, and in particular, this loophole that allowed you to purchase technology much more quickly that one of your staffers found. Tell that story, and maybe that'll help people understand kind of the systems that you were up against.
It's an amazing story, but we knew when we arrived in Silicon Valley that we would fail unless we figured out a different way to contract with firms. And our first week in the office, this 29-year-old staff member named Lauren Daly, the daughter actually of a tank commander whose way of serving was to become a civilian in the Pentagon and work on acquisition, happened to be up because she's a total acquisition nerd, late at night reading the just released National Defense Authorization Act, which is another dictionary-sized compendium of law that comes out every year. And she was flipping through it, trying to find new provisions in law that might change how acquisition worked. And sure enough, in Section 815 of the law, she found a single sentence that she realized somebody had placed there that changed everything. And that single sentence would allow us to use a completely different kind of contracting mechanisms called other transaction authorities that were actually first invented during the space race to allow NASA during the Apollo era to contract with mom and pop suppliers. And so she realized that this provision would allow us not only to use OTAs to buy technology, but the really important part is that if it worked, if it was successful in a pilot, we could immediately go to buy it at scale, to buy it in production. We didn't have to recompete it. There would be no pause, no 18-month pause between demonstrating your technology and having the department buy it. And when Lauren brought this to our attention, we thought, oh boy, this really is a game changer. So we flew Lauren to Washington. We had her meet with the head of acquisition policy at the Department of Defense. And in literally 3 weeks, we changed 60 years of Pentagon policy to create a whole new way to buy technology that to this day has been used to purchase $70 billion of technology for the Department of Defense.
You just said that the reason that Silicon Valley tech companies, some of them didn't want to work with the military is because of this sort of arcane and complicated procurement process. But there are also real moral objections among a lot of tech companies and tech workers. In 2018, Google employees famously objected to something called Project Maven, which was a project the company had planned with the Pentagon that would have used their AI image recognition software to improve weapons and things like that. And there have been just a lot of objections over the years from Silicon Valley to working with the military, to being defense contractors. Why do you think that was, and do you think that's changed at all?
It's completely understandable. So few Americans serve in uniform. Most of us don't actually know somebody who's in the military. And it's really easy here in Silicon Valley, where the weather's great. Sure, you read headlines in the news, but the military is not something that you encounter in your daily life. And you join a tech company to make the world better, to develop products that are going to help people. You don't join a tech company assuming that you're going to be making the world a more lethal place. But at the same time, Project Maven was actually something that I got a chance to work on, and Defense Innovation Unit and a whole group of people led. And
remind us what Project Maven was.
So Project Maven was an attempt to use artificial intelligence and machine learning to take a whole bunch of footage, surveillance footage that was being captured in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and other military missions, and to use machine learning to label what was found in this footage. So it was a tool to essentially automate work that otherwise would have taken human analysts hundreds of hours to do. And it was used primarily for intelligence and reconnaissance and force protection. So Project Maven, this is another misconception. When you talk about military systems, there's really a lot of unpacking you have to do. The headline that got Project Maven in trouble said, Google working on secret drone project. And it made it look as if Google was partnering with Defense Innovation Unit and the Department of Defense to build offensive weapons to support the U.S. drone campaign. And that's not all what was happening. What was happening is Google was building tools that would help our analysts process the incredible amount of data flowing off many different observation platforms in the military.
Right. But Google employees objected to this. They made a big case that Google should not participate in Project Maven, and eventually the company pulled out of the project. But speaking of Project Maven, I was curious because there was some reporting from Bloomberg this year that showed that the military has actually used Project Maven's technology as recently as February to identify targets for airstrikes in the Middle East. So isn't that exactly what the Google employees who were protesting Project Maven back when you were working on it at the Defense Department, isn't that exactly what they were scared would happen?
Well, Project Maven, when Google was involved, was very much a pilot R&D project. And it's since transitioned, actually, into much more of an operational phase. And it's being used in a number of places. In fact, it's actually being used in Ukraine as well to help the U.S. identify military targets in Ukraine. And so this, again, speaks to, I think, a sea change in Silicon Valley since that original protest of 3,000 Google employees over Project Maven, where the world has changed a lot, and not for the better. We have a land war going on in Europe on the border of NATO. And in fact, that war, the Ukraine conflict, has mobilized a lot of people in Silicon Valley to want to try and help support Ukraine's quest to defend its territory. And so I think we're in a very different time and moment right now as people watching the news realize that our security is actually quite a bit more fragile than we might have first imagined.
I mean, I think one reaction that our listeners may have to this is they are very concerned about the use of AI and other technologies by the military. And I also hear from a lot of people at the tech companies who are really concerned about some of these contracts. I remember during the Project Maven controversy, talking with people at Google who were part of the protest movement, and some things that they would say to me are like, well, if I wanted to work for a defense contractor, I would have gone to go work for Lockheed Martin or Raytheon. I'm curious, what moral argument would you make to someone who maybe says, look, I did not sign up to make weapons of war. I am an AI engineer. I work on large language models, or I work on image recognition stuff. What do you tell that person if you're working at the DIU trying to persuade them that it's okay to sell or license that technology to the Pentagon?
I think you tell them that we're at an extraordinary moment in the history of war where everything is changing. And I'll just give you a couple data points. A few weeks ago, the United States asked the Ukrainian military to pull back from the front lines all 31 of the M1A1 Abrams tanks that we had deployed to Ukraine to allow their military to better repel the Russian invasion. These are the most advanced tanks, not only in our inventory, but in the inventory of any one of our allies. And they were getting whacked by $2,000 Russian kamikaze drones. $2,000 drones killing tanks. What does that tell me? That tells me that a century of mechanized warfare that began in the First World War is over. And if you're building an army that's full of tanks, you now are the emperor with fewer clothes anyway. And I'll give you a couple other data points. Hamas, has kicked off the largest ground war in the Middle East because of its attack in Israel on the 7th of October. Since the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, threatening to destabilize the Middle East into a wider war. How did they do it? They did it by taking quadcopters and using them to drop grenades on the generators powering the Israeli border towers. That's what allowed the fighters to pour over the border. Another data point, Houthi rebels in Yemen right now are holding hostage 12% of global shipping in the Red Sea because they're using autonomous sea drones, missiles, and loitering munitions to harass shipping. And so we're at this moment where the arsenal of democracy that we have, this incredibly forceful military is full of things like aircraft carriers and tanks, are wielding weapons that are no longer as effective as they were 10 years ago. And if our military and our adversaries doesn't catch up quick, we may be in a situation where we don't have the advantage we once did. And we have to think very differently about our security if that's the case.
I mean, it sounds like you're kind of saying that the way to stop a bad guy with an AI drone is a good guy with an AI drone. Am I hearing you right that you're saying that we have to have such overwhelmingly powerful, lethal technology in our military that other countries won't mess with us?
I totally hear you, and frankly, hear all the people that years ago were affiliated with the Stop Killer Robots movement. I mean, these weapons they're awful things. They do awful things to human beings. But at the same time, there's a deep literature on something called strategic stability that comes out of the Cold War, and part of that literature focuses on the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the fact that actually the proliferation of nuclear weapons has actually reduced great power conflict in the world because nobody actually wants to get in a nuclear exchange. Now, would it be a good idea for everybody in the world to have their own nuclear weapon? Probably not. So all these things have limits. But that's an illustration of how strategic stability, in other words, a balance of power, can actually reduce the chance of conflict in the first place.
Yeah. I'm curious what you make of the Stop Killer Robots movement. There was a petition or an open letter that went around years ago that was signed by a bunch of leaders in AI, including Elon Musk and Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind. They all pledged not to develop autonomous weapons. Do you think that was a good pledge, or do you support autonomous weapons?
I mean, I think autonomous weapons are now kind of a reality in the world. I mean, we're seeing this on the front lines of Ukraine. And, if you're not willing to fight with autonomous weapons, then you're going to lose.
So there's this former OpenAI employee, Leopold Aschenbrenner, who recently released a long manifesto called Situational Awareness. And one of the predictions that he makes is that by about 2027, the U.S. government would recognize that superintelligent AI was such a threat to the world order that AGI, sort of artificial general intelligence, would become functionally a project of the national security state, something like an AGI Manhattan Project. There's other speculation out there that maybe at some point the government would have to nationalize an OpenAI or an Anthropic. Are you hearing any of these whispers yet? Like, are people starting to game this out at all?
Well, I haven't. I confess I haven't made it all through each 155 pages of that long manifesto. But
it was very long. You could summarize it with ChatGPT, though.
Fantastic. Yeah. But these are important things to think about because it could be that in certain kinds of conflicts, whoever has the best AI wins. And if that's the case, and if AI is getting exponentially more powerful, Then, to take things back to the iPhone and the F-35, it's going to be really important that you have the kind of AI of the iPhone variety. You have the AI that's new every year. You don't have the F-35 with the processor that was baked in 2001, and you're only taking off on a runway in 2016. So I do think it's very important for folks to be focused on AI. Where this all goes, though, is a lot of speculation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, if you had to bet in 10 years, do you think that the AI companies will all still be private, or do you think the government will have stepped in and gotten way more interested in maybe taking one of them over?
Well, I'd make the observation that, we all watched Oppenheimer, especially employees at AI firms. They seem to love that film. And, nuclear technology, it's what national security strategists would call a point technology. It's sort of 0 to 1. Either you have it or you don't. And AI is not going to end up being a point technology. It's a very broadly diffuse technology that's going to be applied not only in weapon systems, but in institutions. It's going to be broadly diffused around the economy. And for that reason, I don't think, or it's less likely anyway, that we're going to end up in a situation where somebody has the bomb and somebody doesn't. I think the gradations are going to be smoother and not quite as sharp.
Part of what we've seen in other industries as technology sort of moves in and modernizes things is that often things become cheaper. It's cheaper to do things using the latest technology than it is to do using outdated technology. Do you think some of the work that you've done at DIU trying to modernize how the Pentagon works is going to result in smaller defense budgets being necessary going forward? Is the $2 trillion or so that the DoD has budgeted for this year, could that be $1 trillion or $500 billion in the coming years because of some of these modernizations?
You're giving us a raise, Kevin. I think it's more like 800 billion.
Well, I'm sorry. I got that answer from Google's AI overview, which also told me to eat rocks and put glue on my pizza.
We should get the Secretary of Defense to try to. He'd like that answer if he had that large of a budget. Well, it's certainly true that for a lot less money now, you can have a really destructive effect on the world, as drone pilots in Ukraine and elsewhere in the world are showing. I think it's also true that the U.S. military has a whole bunch of legacy weapon systems that, unfortunately, are kind of like museum relics, right? I mean, if our most advanced tank can be destroyed by a drone, it might be time to retire our tank fleet. If our aircraft carriers cannot be defended against a hypersonic missile attack, it's probably not a good idea to sail one of our aircraft carriers anywhere near an advanced adversary. So I think it is an opportune moment to really look at what we are spending our money on at the Defense Department and remember the goal of our nation's founders, which is to spend what we need to on defense and not a penny more.
So I hear you saying that it's very important for the military to be prepared technologically for the world we're in, and that means working with Silicon Valley. But is there anything like more specific that you want to share that you think that either side needs to be doing here, or something specific that you want to see out of that collaboration?
Well, I think one of the main goals of Defense Innovation Unit was literally to get the two groups talking. Before Defense Innovation Unit was founded, a Secretary of Defense hadn't been to Silicon Valley in 20 years. I mean, that's almost a generation. So Silicon Valley invents the mobile phone. It invents cloud computing. It invents AI. And nobody from the Defense Department bothers to even come and visit. And that's a problem. And so just bringing the two sides into conversation is itself, I think, a great achievement.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Chris. Hey, that's the end of this clip. If you liked what you saw, head on over to our page and subscribe, and you can get the full podcast. We do a show like this almost every week on tech and the future. Head on over there now and subscribe.